They survived the war. But the war didn't let them go. They crossed oceans, jungles, and fire. They endured fear every single day, knowing that any step could be their last. They watched friends disappear in seconds. They learned how to live with death so close it became routine. And when they finally came home, they were treated like criminals. This is not a metaphor. This is not exaggeration. This is history. For thousands of Vietnam veterans, the most humiliating and destructive moments of their lives did not happen in the jungle. They happened on American soil. Airports, streets, college campuses, bus stations, places that were supposed to feel safe. They didn't come home to parades. They didn't come home to applause. They didn't come home to gratitude. They came home to insults, to silence, to shame. Many of them never spoke about it again. This part of history is uncomfortable. So it was buried. But it didn't disappear. It lived inside the men who carried it. In 1971, a young American soldier stepped off a plane after more than a year in Vietnam. He was 20 years old. He had survived ambushes, booby traps, and nights where sleep felt more dangerous than staying awake. He had learned to flinch at sudden sounds. He had learned to scan every crowd. He had learned to keep his emotions buried deep, because emotion got you killed. He expected relief. He expected to finally breathe. Instead, he was met with disgust. People stared at his uniform. Some turned away. Others didn't. Someone yelled at him. Another spat near his boots. A stranger called him a murderer. He stood there, frozen, holding his duffel bag, trying to understand how the same country that sent him to war now wanted nothing to do with him. No one explained anything. No one prepared them for this. During World War II, soldiers returned as heroes. Flags waved. Families gathered. Entire cities celebrated. Vietnam was different. This war followed them home. And so did the anger surrounding it. To understand why Vietnam veterans were treated this way, you have to understand what kind of war Vietnam was, and how deeply it divided the country that sent them there. Vietnam was not a war with clear victories. It had no defined front lines. No triumphant endings. It was confusing. Prolonged. Relentless. Young men were drafted, trained quickly, and sent into a conflict most of them didn't fully understand. They weren't fighting an army that stood in formation. They were fighting an enemy that blended into villages, forests, and civilians. Every decision carried moral weight. Every mistake haunted them. Back home, the war was on television every night. Images of burned villages, wounded civilians, and body bags filled living rooms across America. Public opinion began to shift. Anger toward the war turned into anger toward those who fought it. But the soldiers didn't choose the war. They didn't write the policies. They didn't decide the strategy. They were sent. Still, they became the face of everything people hated about Vietnam. When veterans returned, many were told to remove their uniforms before traveling. Some were advised not to tell anyone where they had been. Not because they were ashamed, but because they were warned. At airports, veterans were harassed. Called killers. Called baby murderers. Accused of crimes they never committed. Some were shoved. Some were threatened. Most were ignored completely. Imagine surviving a war and then being told your service made you less human. For many veterans, this rejection cut deeper than anything they experienced overseas. In Vietnam, they had a mission. They had brothers beside them. They had structure. At home, they had nothing. No understanding. No support. No place to put the memories they carried. They were expected to return to normal life, as if nothing had happened. But nothing was normal anymore. Nightmares followed them. Loud noises triggered panic. Crowds felt dangerous. And yet, when they struggled, society didn't see trauma. It saw weakness. Or worse, guilt. Some veterans tried to talk about what they had seen. Most quickly learned not to. People didn't want to hear about Vietnam. They wanted it forgotten. Jobs were hard to find. Employers looked at them differently. Landlords hesitated. Friends drifted away. Many veterans felt like strangers in their own country. They had left as boys. They came back as men shaped by violence and loss. But there was no place for them anymore. This rejection had consequences. Alcohol. Drugs. Isolation. Some veterans slept in their cars. Others disappeared into the streets. Many carried their anger inward, where it slowly destroyed them. They didn't receive counseling. They didn't receive understanding. Post-traumatic stress wasn't widely recognized. And when it was often misunderstood. Instead of help, they received judgment. Instead of compassion, they received silence. This wasn't an accident. It was a failure. A failure of leadership. A failure of society. A failure to separate a war from the people forced to fight it. And for decades, this failure remained largely unspoken. History books focused on battles and politics. Movies focused on spectacle. But the quiet suffering of veterans was pushed aside. This story is not about defending the Vietnam War. It is about understanding what happened to the men who survived it. Because the war didn't end when they came home. For many of them, that's when it truly began. And what happened next would leave scars far deeper than any wound they received in Vietnam. This is the story of what happens after the fighting stops. When the planes landed and the uniforms came off, there was no ceremony marking the end of the war for Vietnam veterans. There was only an expectation. An expectation that they would forget. That they would move on. That they would stay quiet. America wanted distance from Vietnam. And the fastest way to create that distance was to push the soldiers out of sight. Many veterans returned to towns that felt unfamiliar. Places that looked the same, but no longer felt like home. The people they left behind had changed. And so had they. Families often didn't know how to talk to them. Parents avoided questions. Friends avoided the subject entirely. It wasn't malicious. It was fear. Fear of hearing things they couldn't understand. Fear of confronting what the war had done. So conversations stayed shallow. How was it? Are you okay now? Questions with no space for real answers. Veterans learned quickly that honesty made people uncomfortable. When they spoke about Vietnam, faces tightened. Eyes looked away. Some conversations ended abruptly. The message was clear. Whatever you brought back with you, carry it alone. At the same time, the country was tearing itself apart over the war. Protests filled the streets. Campuses became battlegrounds of ideology. Anger toward the government burned hot. But again, the target was misplaced. Many protesters didn't distinguish between policymakers and the men sent to execute those policies. To them, the uniform symbolized the war itself. Veterans were confronted in public spaces. Some were shouted down. Some were followed. Some were physically attacked. They were accused of atrocities without context. Without evidence. Without understanding. For soldiers who had already been forced to make impossible moral choices, these accusations were devastating. They had carried guilt long before anyone accused them of anything. Now that guilt was being amplified and weaponized. And there was no refuge. Veterans organizations that had supported previous generations were unprepared. The Veterans Administration was overwhelmed and underfunded. Mental health resources were scarce and poorly understood. Many veterans sought help and were turned away. Or worse, dismissed. They were told to toughen up. To stop dwelling on the past. To be grateful they made it home. But survival did not mean peace. For many, Vietnam replayed endlessly in their minds. The sounds. The smells. The faces. Memories surfaced without warning. In grocery stores. On highways. In the middle of conversations. A slammed door could send them back into the jungle. Fireworks felt like incoming artillery. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares were vivid and relentless. Some veterans avoided sleep altogether. Others self-medicated. Alcohol dulled the edges, at least temporarily. Drugs quieted the noise, until they didn't. Addiction became a silent epidemic among Vietnam veterans. But society didn't see trauma. It saw failure. When veterans struggled to hold jobs, they were labeled unstable. When they isolated themselves, they were labeled antisocial. When they lashed out, they were labeled dangerous. Rarely did anyone ask why. Rarely did anyone connect their pain to the war. Instead of being recognized as victims of trauma, many veterans were treated as threats. Law enforcement encounters often escalated quickly. Veterans reacted instinctively, defensively, shaped by years of conditioning. Misunderstandings turned into arrests. Arrests turned into criminal records. The irony was cruel. Men trained by the government to survive chaos were now punished for reacting to it. Some veterans ended up in prison. Others cycled through hospitals and jails. Many simply vanished from public life. Homelessness among Vietnam veterans surged. On city streets, men who had once worn uniforms slept under bridges and in doorways. Passers-by rarely knew who they were, and rarely asked. The nation had moved on. Meanwhile, veterans carried a growing sense of betrayal. They had done what was asked of them. They had followed orders. They had survived. And yet, they were treated as if they had committed some unspoken crime. This betrayal cut deep. It reshaped how veterans saw authority, how they saw society, how they saw themselves. Many internalized the blame. They wondered if they deserved the hatred, if they were truly broken, if the world would ever make space for them again. Some tried to rebuild quietly. They married. They raised families. They worked when they could. But the war lingered beneath the surface. Relationships strained under the weight of unspoken memories. Children sensed the distance. Spouses felt the emotional walls. Vietnam veterans became known as a lost generation. Not because they were weak, but because they were abandoned. It took years, decades, for the country to begin acknowledging what had happened. And even then, the recognition came slowly. Too slowly for many. By the time society started talking openly about post-traumatic stress, countless veterans had already suffered in silence. Some never lived to see that understanding. Others lived long enough to wonder why it took so long. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a collective one. A nation failed to care for those it sent to war. And the consequences of that failure would echo for generations. Because the scars left by Vietnam weren't only on the battlefield. They were etched into the lives of the men who came home, and into a society that wasn't ready to face what it had done. And the deeper you look into their stories, the clearer one truth becomes. The way Vietnam veterans were treated after the war may be one of the darkest chapters in modern American history. As the years passed, the damage became harder to ignore. By the mid-1970s, cracks were forming in the official narrative that Vietnam veterans were simply troubled or unstable. Patterns began to emerge. Veterans were showing up in emergency rooms with panic attacks, flashbacks, and uncontrollable rage. They were being arrested for fights they couldn't remember starting. They were losing families, jobs, and entire futures. Yet the system still refused to name the problem. At the time, post-traumatic stress disorder was not fully recognized. What we now call PTSD was often dismissed as combat fatigue stress reaction, or a personal failure to adjust. Vietnam veterans were told the war was over. Their minds refused to agree. The Veterans Administration was unprepared and overwhelmed. Hospitals were understaffed. Mental health services were minimal. Waiting lists stretched for months, sometimes years. Many veterans gave up trying to get help. Others were misdiagnosed. Some were labeled schizophrenic. Some were given heavy sedatives and sent away. Treatment focused on suppressing symptoms, not understanding them. And all the while, the public narrative continued to paint veterans as dangerous. High-profile media coverage of atrocities committed during the war, often stripped of context, intensified public anger. The most infamous incidents became symbols, repeated endlessly, until they overshadowed the reality that most soldiers were terrified young men trying to survive. The complexity of Vietnam was reduced to slogans. Nuance disappeared. In that environment, veterans became convenient targets. If the war was wrong, someone had to be blamed. And the soldiers were visible. Politicians distanced themselves. Institutions protected themselves. The burden fell on those with the least power. Veterans learned to stay quiet. They stopped wearing anything that identified them as former soldiers. Medals were hidden in drawers. Uniforms were boxed away. For many, silence felt safer than honesty. But silence came at a cost. Without the ability to speak openly, trauma hardened. Memories calcified. Pain became identity. Some veterans joined underground support groups, meeting in basements and community halls. They shared stories not to relive the war, but to survive it. These groups were often the first places where veterans felt understood. There were no judgments. No accusations. Only recognition. They realized something critical. They were not alone. What they were experiencing had names, patterns, causes. And slowly, a new truth began to surface. The problem was not that Vietnam veterans were broken. The problem was that they had been placed in impossible situations and then abandoned. Researchers began to take notice. Psychologists listened. Veterans started speaking publicly, despite the backlash. Their testimonies were raw and unsettling. They described constant vigilance, emotional numbness, sudden rage followed by deep shame. They described feeling detached from reality, as if part of them had never left Vietnam. These accounts forced a reckoning. By the late 1970s, pressure mounted to formally recognize post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1980, PTSD was officially added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It was a turning point. But it came late. Far too late. For years, veterans had been punished for symptoms they couldn't control. They had been criminalized for trauma, marginalized for survival responses. Recognition did not erase the damage already done. Careers were lost. Families were broken. Lives were shortened. And even after PTSD was acknowledged, stigma remained. Many veterans hesitated to seek help, fearing it would label them as unstable or dangerous. Trust in institutions had already been shattered. The damage went beyond individual lives. Communities suffered. Children grew up with distant fathers. Spouses learned to navigate unpredictable emotional landscapes. The war echoed through generations. Yet despite everything, many Vietnam veterans continued to serve in quieter ways. They volunteered. They mentored younger veterans. They worked to prevent future generations from being treated the same way. Their resilience went largely unnoticed. History books still focused on battles and strategies. Public memory still struggled with discomfort. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The conversation was shifting. People began asking harder questions. What responsibility does a nation have to those it sends to war? What happens when that responsibility is ignored? Vietnam veterans forced society to confront these questions, not through protest, but through endurance. They carried the consequences long enough that ignoring them became impossible. Still, acknowledgement did not equal justice. An apology does not restore lost years. Understanding does not erase suffering. And many veterans would never fully trust the country that turned away from them. They learned a painful lesson. Surviving the war was only half the battle. The other half was surviving what came after. And for countless Vietnam veterans, that second battle was fought alone. Against memories, against judgment, and against a society that wasn't ready to face the cost of its own decisions. This is the legacy that followed them. And it is far from over. By the 1980s, the image of the Vietnam veteran had become deeply distorted. In popular culture, they were often portrayed as unstable, violent, or broken beyond repair. Movies and television leaned into extremes, either the uncontrollable killer or the tragic outcast. Rarely did they show the full truth. This portrayal reinforced fear rather than understanding. And fear shaped policy, law enforcement, and public behavior. Vietnam veterans were watched more closely, judged more harshly, given less benefit of the doubt. For many, this translated into constant tension with authority. A routine traffic stop could escalate. A misunderstanding could spiral out of control. Veterans had been trained to react instantly to perceived threats. Hypervigilance had kept them alive in Vietnam. At home, it made them targets. Police encounters involving veterans often ended violently, not because veterans were criminals, but because their nervous systems were still at war. These incidents were rarely contextualized. The headlines focused on outcomes, not causes. Another veteran arrested. Another veteran shot. Another unstable, former soldier. The deeper story went untold. At the same time, many veterans were struggling to reclaim their identities. They asked themselves questions they had never needed to ask before. Who am I without the uniform? Who am I outside of survival? In Vietnam, clarity existed. There was danger. There were orders. There was purpose. Back home, purpose vanished. Society offered no ritual of reintegration. No structured transition. No acknowledgement of transformation. Veterans were expected to simply resume their old lives. But the person who left no longer existed. This identity collapse was devastating. Some veterans became obsessed with control, strict routines, isolation, emotional detachment. Others drifted, unable to anchor themselves to anything lasting. Many felt permanently out of sync with civilian life. They didn't trust crowds. They didn't trust institutions. Often, they didn't trust themselves. Marriage rates among Vietnam veterans suffered. Divorce rates climbed. Domestic relationships strained under unspoken trauma. Children grew up sensing fear and anger they couldn't explain. Generational trauma took root. The war was over, but its psychological footprint spread outward, affecting families and communities. Meanwhile, public recognition lagged behind reality. Unlike World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans waited decades for meaningful acknowledgement. The first Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., was not dedicated until 1982, 7 years after the war ended. Even its creation was controversial. Some argued it would reopen wounds. Others claimed it glorified a failed war. For veterans, the memorial was not about politics. It was about names. About proof that those who died had existed. That their sacrifices were real. When the memorial was unveiled, something unexpected happened. Veterans wept openly. Many touched the wall as if searching for lost friends. For some, it was the first time they felt seen. But a memorial could not undo years of neglect. It could not restore lost trust. For veterans who had been arrested, institutionalized, or marginalized, recognition felt hollow. The damage had already spread too far. Yet even in the face of neglect, veterans continued to adapt. They formed advocacy groups. They pushed for better mental health care. They fought for recognition of PTSD and Agent Orange exposure. Progress came slowly, often through resistance. Each improvement was paid for with years of persistence and pain. Still, public perception changed at a glacial pace. The label of criminal lingered, not always spoken, but implied. In workplaces, in neighborhoods, in institutions. Veterans felt it in subtle ways. The hesitation before a handshake. The guarded tone of conversations. The quiet assumption that something was wrong with them. This constant social friction wore people down. Living under suspicion drains the spirit. Many veterans withdrew completely. Others became angry advocates, determined to make sure future generations were treated differently. Their struggle reshaped military policy, mental health awareness, and veteran support systems. But these changes came too late for many. By the time society began to learn, countless veterans had already paid the price. They had been punished not for crimes, but for carrying the psychological scars of a war the country no longer wanted to remember. And this raises an uncomfortable truth. When a nation refuses to take responsibility for its wars, it looks for scapegoats. In Vietnam's aftermath, those scapegoats were the soldiers themselves. They bore the shame. They absorbed the blame. They carried the silence. Not because they deserved it, but because society needed someone to hold accountable. This pattern is not unique to Vietnam. But Vietnam made it impossible to ignore. And as time moved forward, the consequences of that failure would shape how future wars, and future veterans, were handled. The question was whether the lesson had truly been learned, or whether it would be forgotten again, waiting to repeat itself in another generation. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the consequences of how Vietnam veterans were treated became impossible to deny. Studies began to reveal alarming patterns. Vietnam veterans were experiencing higher rates of homelessness than any previous generation of soldiers. Suicide rates were significantly elevated. Substance abuse was widespread. These were not isolated cases. They were systemic outcomes. For years, veterans had been treated as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. Many of them had internalized the message society sent them. That their pain was inconvenient. That their stories were unwanted. That their presence was a reminder of a war best forgotten. So they disappeared. Some drifted from city to city, never staying long enough to form connections. Others cut ties with family entirely, believing distance would protect the people they loved from their instability. Isolation became a form of self-control. If they stayed alone, they couldn't hurt anyone. This belief destroyed countless lives quietly. At the same time, the criminal justice system absorbed many veterans who should have received medical care. Trauma manifested as aggression, impulsivity, and hyperreactivity. Behaviors shaped by survival instincts were treated as criminal intent. A veteran startled by a sudden movement reacted. A confrontation escalated. The outcome was arrest. Courtrooms rarely considered combat trauma. Judges saw behavior, not history. Prisons filled with men who had once served their country. Inside those walls, the same patterns repeated. Authority. Confinement. Loss of control. For many veterans, incarceration mirrored the worst aspects of war, without purpose or brotherhood. Some deteriorated rapidly. Others hardened. Either way, the system reinforced the idea that they were broken beyond repair. Meanwhile, the public narrative remained simplistic. Vietnam veterans were still often portrayed as ticking time bombs. News coverage highlighted rare violent incidents, while ignoring the millions who lived quietly with their pain. Fear overshadowed empathy. This fear had consequences beyond perception. Employers hesitated to hire veterans. Landlords hesitated to rent to them. Communities hesitated to trust them. The label followed them everywhere. And labels have power. Over time, many veterans stopped trying to prove they were normal. They stopped asking for understanding. They accepted the role society assigned them. Not because it was true, but because resistance was exhausting. Yet beneath this resignation, something else was happening. Veterans were connecting with each other in new ways. Peer support networks grew stronger. Veteran-led counseling programs emerged. Grassroots organizations filled gaps left by institutions. These spaces mattered. For the first time, many veterans were able to speak without being judged. They could express anger without being feared. They could grieve without being dismissed. In these communities, veterans reclaimed language for their experiences. What they felt was not madness. It was trauma. What they struggled with was not weakness. It was conditioning. Naming the problem did not solve it. But it shifted the burden of shame. Slowly, society began to listen. Academic research expanded. Journalists revisited old assumptions. Public conversations grew more nuanced. But progress came unevenly. Recognition often arrived after irreversible damage had already been done. Veterans who had spent years on the streets did not suddenly reintegrate because attitudes changed. Those who had lost families did not easily rebuild them. Acknowledgement did not reverse time. And for many veterans, bitterness remained. They watched as later generations of soldiers received public support, therapy, and reintegration programs. They asked themselves a painful question. Why not us? Why were we treated as expendable after the war ended? This question haunted them. It challenged their sense of loyalty, their faith in institutions, their belief in national responsibility. Some veterans channeled that anger into advocacy. They testified before Congress. They spoke in schools. They demanded that no future generation be abandoned the way they were. Others withdrew completely, unwilling to reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Both responses were understandable. Both were shaped by betrayal. The truth is, the damage inflicted on Vietnam veterans cannot be measured solely in statistics. It lives in fractured relationships, in lost potential, in years spent surviving rather than living. It lives in the silence of men who never told their stories. And it lives in a society that took far too long to ask the right questions. The treatment of Vietnam veterans was not just a failure of compassion. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when a nation separates itself from the human cost of its decisions. When war becomes abstract, those who fight it become disposable. Vietnam veterans paid that price. Not once, but every day they were forced to live with memories no one wanted to acknowledge. And as the years moved forward, one truth became increasingly clear. Healing could not happen without accountability. And accountability could not exist without confronting the uncomfortable reality of how these veterans were treated. Not as heroes. Not even as victims. But as criminals. A label that never belonged to them. And one that would continue to shape their lives long after the war itself faded from memory. As the 21st century approached, the narrative around Vietnam veterans began to shift, but the shift was incomplete. Public sympathy grew. Awareness campaigns emerged. Terms like PTSD entered everyday language. Yet for many veterans, this recognition felt distant, almost theoretical. They had already lived through decades of misunderstanding. Decades of being feared, judged, or ignored. You cannot undo that kind of damage with a change in vocabulary. For many veterans, the problem was not that society finally understood trauma. It was that society understood it too late. By the time compassion arrived, trust was gone. Veterans had learned to expect disappointment. Promises sounded hollow. Institutions felt performative. Some veterans rejected help outright, not out of pride, but out of experience. They had asked before. They had been dismissed before. They had been punished before. Why try again? This skepticism created a new barrier. Even as services improved, many veterans remained isolated, disconnected from systems designed to support them. And isolation reinforced the original wound. Being treated like a criminal doesn't just harm how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. Over time, many Vietnam veterans internalized suspicion. They monitored their own emotions constantly. They questioned their own reactions. They feared losing control, not because they wanted to hurt anyone, but because they had been taught that their instincts were dangerous. This hyper-self-surveillance was exhausting. It left little room for joy, little room for rest. Life became about managing damage. Some veterans described feeling permanently out of place. Too aggressive for civilian life. Too broken for hero narratives. They existed in a psychological no-man's land. And society offered no map. Even public attempts at reconciliation were complicated. Parades honoring Vietnam veterans, when they finally occurred, were often bittersweet. Some veterans attended. Others stayed away. They didn't know how to receive praise decades after being condemned. Applause felt confusing. Sometimes insulting. Where was this when they needed it? Why now? For some, recognition reopened wounds they had spent years trying to seal. Memories flooded back. Anger resurfaced. The past was not something that could be revisited safely. It was something that still lived inside them. This emotional complexity rarely made headlines. Public narratives prefer resolution. They prefer clean endings. But trauma doesn't follow a narrative arc. It lingers. It mutates. It resurfaces. Vietnam veterans were often asked to forgive, to move on, to accept apologies offered by institutions that had once abandoned them. Some did. Many could not. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement of harm. And for years, harm had been denied. Even now, some veterans feel that the focus remains on optics rather than accountability. Memorials exist. Ceremonies exist. But accountability is quieter. It exists in policies, in long-term care, in sustained commitment. And that commitment has been uneven. The treatment of Vietnam veterans forced the military and government to reconsider how future wars would be handled. Lessons were learned. But they were learned through suffering. Reintegration programs improved. Mental health screenings became standard. Public messaging changed. Later generations of veterans would benefit from these reforms. But Vietnam veterans watched from the margins. They saw progress built on their pain. That realization carried its own weight. Some found meaning in that legacy. They told themselves their suffering was not meaningless if it prevented others from enduring the same neglect. Others struggled with resentment. Both responses were human. Both were shaped by history. As time passed, Vietnam veterans aged. Their bodies carried the wear of combat. Their minds carried decades of unprocessed memory. New challenges emerged. Aging intensified symptoms of trauma. Retirement removed distractions. Loss of peers brought grief back to the surface. For many veterans, later life was not peaceful. It was reflective. And reflection can be dangerous when wounds remain open. Some veterans finally spoke openly for the first time late in life. They told stories they had never shared. With spouses. With children. With therapists. These moments were powerful. But they were also heartbreaking. Decades of silence cannot be undone quickly. And many veterans died before they could speak at all. They took their stories with them. Stories of fear. Stories of moral conflict. Stories of betrayal. History lost those voices. And when voices disappear, responsibility becomes easier to avoid. That is why telling these stories matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to prevent erasure. Because when a society forgets how it treated its veterans, it risks repeating the same mistakes. Vietnam veterans were not criminals. They were not villains. They were not symbols. They were people. People who answered a call. People who endured unimaginable conditions. People who came home expecting safety, and found judgment instead. Their story is not just about the past. It is a warning. A warning about what happens when political conflict eclipses human responsibility. When anger seeks an easy target. When nations fail to separate war from the individuals forced to fight it. The scars carried by Vietnam veterans did not come only from the jungle. They came from home. From rejection. From silence. From being treated as something they never were. And unless those scars are acknowledged honestly, not ceremonially, not symbolically, but truthfully, they will continue to shape how future generations understand war, service, and responsibility. Because the cost of war does not end when the fighting stops. It follows people. And how a society responds to those people defines far more than any battlefield ever could. As Vietnam veterans entered the later stages of their lives, the question that haunted many of them remained unanswered. Was any of it worth it? This was not a political question. It was a personal one. They did not ask whether the war achieved its goals. They asked whether the sacrifices they made had meaning in a country that once rejected them. For many veterans, the answer shifted over time. In their younger years, anger dominated. Anger at the government. Anger at society. Anger at themselves. With age, anger often softened into something heavier. Grief. Grief for friends who never came home. Grief for years lost to addiction, isolation, and silence. Grief for versions of themselves that never had a chance to exist. This grief was rarely acknowledged publicly. Vietnam veterans were expected to age quietly, to disappear politely. But trauma does not fade simply because time passes. It adapts. For some veterans, memories intensified as they grew older. Neurological changes reduced their ability to suppress intrusive thoughts. Dementia and Alzheimer's blurred boundaries between past and present. Vietnam returned without warning. Caregivers and family members witnessed sudden shifts. Calm moments shattered by fear. Gentle men reliving firefights in living rooms. These moments were confusing and painful for everyone involved. They also revealed a truth that had been ignored for decades. The war never left. Even as society improved its understanding of trauma, Vietnam veterans often felt left behind. They were older, less visible, less vocal. Resources increasingly focused on newer generations of veterans. Again, Vietnam veterans found themselves at the margins. Not intentionally, but inevitably. And for those who had already learned to expect abandonment, this felt familiar. Some veterans responded by withdrawing completely. Others became storytellers. They began speaking publicly, not because it was easy, but because silence had failed them. They spoke to students, to journalists, to researchers. They described not only the war, but what came after. The humiliation, the isolation, the criminalization. These testimonies were uncomfortable. They challenged comforting narratives. They forced listeners to confront a reality that did not align with national self-image. And that discomfort was necessary. Because history that avoids discomfort is not history. It is mythology. Vietnam veterans disrupted that mythology. They refused to be reduced to stereotypes. Neither heroes nor villains. They insisted on being seen as human. Some found healing in this truth-telling. Others found only exhaustion. Speaking did not erase the past. But it reclaimed agency. It allowed veterans to define their experiences on their own terms. For families, these stories filled gaps. Children finally understood the distance they had felt growing up. Spouses understood the silences. Understanding did not fix everything. But it softened blame. It replaced confusion with context. This intergenerational understanding mattered. Because the legacy of Vietnam extended beyond the veterans themselves. It shaped how families related to authority. How communities viewed war. How future soldiers prepared for what awaited them at home. Vietnam veterans became cautionary examples. Not of failure, but of neglect. Their lives demonstrated what happens when reintegration is treated as an afterthought. When mental health is politicized. When responsibility is deferred. Some veterans expressed a quiet hope. That their suffering would serve as a lesson. That no future generation would be sent to war and then abandoned. That no soldier would be made to feel like a criminal for surviving. Whether that hope will be fully realized remains uncertain. Wars continue. Veterans continue to return. Support systems have improved, but they remain imperfect. Public attention shifts quickly. Memory fades. And when memory fades, mistakes return. This is why the story of Vietnam veterans matters now. Not because it belongs to the past, but because its patterns are still visible. The language may change. The uniforms may change. But the risk remains the same. That society will once again confuse disagreement with policy for judgment of people. That anger will seek the nearest symbol. That soldiers will become scapegoats. Vietnam veterans paid the price for that confusion. They absorbed the backlash of a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its actions. They endured rejection in silence so complete that many believed no one would ever listen. But history does not end with silence. It ends with remembrance, or repetition. The stories of Vietnam veterans demand remembrance. Not as political arguments. Not as cautionary headlines. But as human testimony. They remind us that the true measure of a nation's character is not how it wages war, but how it treats those it sends to fight it. And for Vietnam veterans, that treatment left scars that time alone could never heal. Scars shaped by combat, and scars carved by home. And as their voices grow fewer with each passing year, one responsibility grows heavier: to listen, to remember, and to ensure that never again will survival be mistaken for guilt. Because the greatest injustice they endured was not the war itself. It was coming home, and being treated like criminals. The story of Vietnam veterans does not end with recognition, memorials, or changed language. Those things matter, but they do not close the wound. For many veterans, closure was never possible. Because the damage was not a single moment. It was years of being misunderstood, rejected, and blamed. They were asked to carry the consequences of decisions they did not make. They were punished for surviving a war the nation later regretted. And that truth should unsettle us, because it reveals something uncomfortable about how societies behave in moments of shame. When outcomes are painful, responsibility is often displaced. When wars become unpopular, the people who fought them become convenient targets. Vietnam veterans became symbols for a conflict Americans wanted to forget. And symbols are easier to condemn than systems. What happened to them was not inevitable. It was a choice. A choice to look away. A choice to simplify. A choice to let anger override empathy. That choice left lasting scars. Scars that shaped lives, families, communities, and scars that continue to influence how veterans see themselves, even now. Some Vietnam veterans never stopped believing they were unwanted. Others never stopped waiting for acknowledgement that came too late. Many carried both beliefs at once. As time moves forward, the number of living Vietnam veterans continues to shrink. With each passing year, more voices are lost. And when voices disappear, stories risk being rewritten or erased. That is why this history matters. Not to reopen old arguments. Not to assign guilt to individuals who came later. But to confront a failure honestly. Because when we fail to confront the past, we repeat its patterns. Vietnam veterans were treated like criminals not because they were criminals, but because society needed distance from its own decisions. They absorbed the backlash of a divided nation. They paid for it with silence, with isolation, with years stolen from their lives. Their experience forces a question that extends beyond Vietnam. How do we treat those we send to war when the war becomes inconvenient? Do we listen? Do we care? Or do we turn away and hope time will erase responsibility? The answer to that question defines more than policy. It defines character. For decades, Vietnam veterans carried the burden alone. They endured being feared instead of understood, judged instead of supported, forgotten instead of honored. Yet many of them still found ways to live, to love, to protect others from the same fate. Their resilience does not excuse what happened to them. It highlights it. Because resilience should never be a requirement for dignity. Dignity should be guaranteed. The true legacy of Vietnam is not found only in history books or battle maps. It is found in the lives of the men who came home and discovered that survival was not enough. They remind us that war does not end when the fighting stops. It ends only when responsibility is taken seriously. When care replaces judgment. When understanding replaces fear. And when those who are sent to fight are never again made to feel like criminals for doing exactly what they were asked to do. The scars of Vietnam are not only scars of war. They are scars of neglect. And remembering them is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of accountability. Because the moment a society forgets how it treated its veterans, it begins preparing to fail the next generation all over again. And that may be the greatest lesson Vietnam veterans leave behind. Not about war, but about what happens when a nation turns its back on those it once sent into the fire.